Inside a guarded laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, a sphere of plutonium, no larger than a softball, sat on a workbench, surrounded by a handful of scientists. In a single careless second, it slipped over the edge into a runaway nuclear chain reaction, flooding the room with a blue glow and a wave of heat the men could feel on their faces. And astonishingly, this was not the first time it had happened, nor the first man it had happened. This is the Demon Core. Over the course of just 9 months in 1945 and 1946, it killed 2 of the brilliant young men who worked on it, and it quietly dosed everyone who happened to be standing nearby. The 2 deaths became legend. But what happened to all of the other people in those rooms is a story that almost never gets told. So in this video, we're going to follow every one of them. By the end, you will be able to explain what the Demon Core actually was, how its 2 deadly accidents unfolded, and what became of all 10 people who were in or beside those rooms. Some of those fates are absolutely certain. As you'll see, many of them are not. The Core was born for war. In the summer of 1945, Los Alamos forged this 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium as the heart of a 3rd atomic bomb, one meant to be dropped on Japan if the war did not end. Faintly radioactive, the finished sphere was warm to the touch, like a small living thing that never quite cooled. But Japan surrendered on August the 15th, before that 3rd Core ever left New Mexico. The bomb it was meant for was never assembled, and so this finished mass of plutonium, worth more than its weight in gold and engineered for a single catastrophic purpose, suddenly had no city to destroy and nowhere to go. So the physicists kept it for research. They used it to study criticality, the precise tipping point at which a mass of fissile material begins to sustain its own runaway chain reaction. Understanding that exact boundary was vital to designing safer, more efficient weapons, and the only way to map it was to creep right up to the edge by hand. The work was so dangerous that the physicist Richard Feynman reportedly compared it to tickling the tail of a sleeping dragon. The technique was to surround the plutonium with materials that reflect escaping neutrons back into the core. Each addition nudged the sphere closer to the chain reaction, and the experimenter's job was to stop just short of waking the dragon. A single careless centimeter, one extra block of reflector in the wrong place, could turn a routine afternoon measurement into a fatal flood of radiation. Sitting alone on the bench, the sphere was perfectly safe, well below critical. But packed neutron-reflecting material tightly around it, and those bounced-back neutrons could dip it into a supercritical burst in a fraction of a second. The entire margin between a routine experiment and a lethal accident was measured in millimeters of distance and split seconds of time. On the night of August 21st, 1945, that margin vanished for the first time. Harry Daghlian was a 24-year-old physicist, a Purdue graduate who had joined the Manhattan Project the year before. He was working late and alone, against the rules, building a wall of tungsten carbide bricks around the core to reflect neutrons back inside. Each brick, he added, brought the assembly closer to the edge of criticality. As Daghlian moved one final block into place above the center, his neutron counters spiked, warning him that this brick would tip the core supercritical. He pulled his hand back to stop, and in that instant the heavy brick slipped from his fingers and dropped squarely onto the core. The core pulsed. Daghlian felt a tingling in his hand and saw the unmistakable blue glow of the air itself being ionized around the plutonium. He reacted in seconds, knocking the brick away with his bare hand to break the reaction apart. He had saved the laboratory, but the invisible damage had already been done deep inside his body. That blue light was the air itself fluorescing under the radiation, a glow that meant a massive unseen dose had already swept through everything and everyone in the room. He had absorbed roughly 510 rem of radiation, a clearly fatal dose. There was no real treatment in 1945, only painkillers and observation as his blood cells collapsed, his hand blistered, and his organs slowly failed. 25 days later, on September the 15th, Harry Daghlian died at the age of 24, the first human being ever killed by a nuclear chain reaction. Here is the first detail that history tends to forget. Daghlian had not actually been alone in that building. A short distance away sat a young Army guard, Private Robert Hemley, on duty at the remote Omega laboratory, reading a newspaper at a desk roughly 12 feet from the core when it flashed. Hemley's dose was only a small fraction of Daghlian's, and he walked out of that building with no symptoms at all. He seemed completely fine. Then, 33 years later, in 1978, Robert Hemley died of acute leukemia. Whether that one distant night at Omega's site caused it, after 3 decades and such a low dose, no one has ever been able to say for certain. The core itself, meanwhile, was completely undamaged. It was cleaned, measured, reshaped, and quietly slotted back into the regular rotation of experiments, as if nothing had happened. But among themselves, the scientists had started giving the sphere a darker, more superstitious name. They began calling it the Demon Core. 9 months later, the Demon Core claimed its second victim. Louis Slotin was 35, a Canadian physicist from Winnipeg, with a doctorate from London, and the laboratory's single most experienced hand at this kind of critical assembly work. By the spring of 1946, he was tired of the danger and was preparing to leave Los Alamos to return to university teaching. On May 21, 1946, he gathered 7 colleagues to demonstrate the procedure one last time to Alvin Graves, the physicist being trained to take over his job. Slotin slowly lowered an upper beryllium shell down over the core, holding the 2 halves apart with nothing more than the blade of an ordinary flathead screwdriver. His own colleagues had repeatedly warned him that this hand method was reckless. Enrico Fermi himself had reportedly told Slotin flatly that he would be dead within a year if he kept performing the experiment this way. On that afternoon, the only thing standing between 8 men and a chain reaction was the steady downward pressure of Slotin's wrist. Then the screwdriver slipped. The upper beryllium shell dropped shut over the core. In an instant, the plutonium flooded with reflected neutrons. The room lit up with the same searing blue flash, and a wave of heat rolled over the men. Slotin felt a sour, metallic taste flood his mouth, and a deep burning in his left hand. In a single reflexive motion, he jerked the shell apart with his bare hands, ending the reaction and physically shielding the men behind him with his own body. Then Slotin did something remarkable. Already understanding that he was a dead man, he calmly had everyone mark exactly where they had been standing, so that each person's individual radiation dose could later be estimated. Those estimates told a brutal story of distance. Slotin, at the very center, had absorbed a clearly fatal dose. The man beside him took far less, and those standing against the back wall received only a small and survivable fraction. Slotin, at the very center of the burst, had absorbed an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 rem, far beyond any possibility of survival. He died 9 excruciating days later, on May 30, 1946, his body failing in much the same way Daglian's had. But this time, 8 other people had been standing in that room, and their stories are where this gets truly interesting. Standing closest to Slotin was Alvin Graves, his designated successor, who absorbed by far the second highest dose of the day, around 190 rem. He fell seriously ill within hours. Doctors initially gave him only about a 50% chance of surviving the coming weeks, and he spent those weeks gravely sick in a hospital bed. But against the odds, Alvin Graves survived. He was left with permanent damage, including cataracts, chronic neurological problems, and lasting changes to his health. And yet he returned to his work with a stubbornness that amazed his colleagues, eventually rising to become the head of the test division that ran America's entire nuclear weapons testing program. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, Graves personally directed test after test in the Nevada desert and out across the Pacific atolls. He died in 1965 of a heart attack while skiing in Colorado at the age of 55. Whether his radiation exposure played any part is still debated, because his own father had also died of heart failure, leaving the question genuinely unresolved. It remains a strange and bitter irony that a man nearly killed by one runaway reaction would spend the rest of his life deliberately setting off far larger ones. Also in the room was Marion C. Slicky, a young metallurgist from Pennsylvania, who absorbed a relatively modest dose. After the war, he moved into private industry, working for companies like General Electric and Union Carbide, contributing to specialized metal alloys and even to the heat shields that protected some of America's earliest space rockets. Then, in 1965, Marion C. Slicky died of leukemia at just 42 years old. His is the one later death, most firmly and directly linked to that day in the laboratory. His widow, Dorothy, filed a negligence complaint against the federal government over his exposure, and after years of legal struggle, the case was quietly settled in 1968. Across the bench stood Dwight Young, by far the oldest man in the room at 53. He was a remarkable figure, a self-taught physicist and photographer with no formal degree, who had earned his place on the project through sheer talent. The radiation burst put him in a hospital bed for more than 4 straight months. Young recovered, and he stayed on at Los Alamos for many years, even earning a full staff position in 1953 despite his lack of credentials. He died in 1975 of a blood disorder that some sources tie to his radiation exposure. But by then he had reached the age of 83, and at a distance of nearly 30 years, certainty quietly dissolves. There was also Alan Klein, a graduate student who had already witnessed history. 4 years earlier, in December 1942, he had stood beneath the bleachers at the University of Chicago as Enrico Fermi started the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction. Klein had watched the atomic age begin. Now he was feeling its heat against his own face. After the flash of the demon core, Alan Klein showed no lasting harm whatsoever. He walked away from physics entirely, went to Yale Law School, and spent the next several decades as a patent attorney in California. He lived to be 81 years old, dying in 2001, a full and ordinary lifetime removed from that single terrifying afternoon. Remus Schreiber was in that room as well, a physicist who had helped arm one of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. He had stood farther back and received one of the lowest doses of anyone present. Schreiber is the man most often credited with giving the sphere its grim nickname, the Demon Core. Deeply shaken by what he had witnessed, he became a forceful advocate for handling dangerous fissile material by remote machine, and never again by human hand. He rose to deputy director of the laboratory and lived a long life, dying at the age of 88. Near the back of the room stood Theodore Perlman, an engineer who had served on Tinian Island during the final atomic bombing missions of the war. His dose that day was minimal, and he showed no signs of harm. Beyond that, history has very nearly forgotten him entirely. Even the basic details of how and when he died remain uncertain. And there was a second young soldier standing guard that day, Private Patrick Cleary, who walked away from the Demon Core completely untouched. But radiation would never get the chance to claim him. Just 4 years later, Cleary was killed in action in the Korean War in September 1950, at the age of only 24. As for the Demon Core itself, its story ended just weeks after Slotin's death. Plan to detonate it in the 1946 Operation Crossroads weapons tests was quietly cancelled. Instead, the infamous sphere was simply melted down, and its plutonium was recast and absorbed back into the rest of the growing American nuclear stockpile, its identity erased. But the lessons it taught outlived the metal. In the wake of Slotin's death, hands-on criticality experiments were banned outright. From that point forward, the Dragon's tail was tickled only by remote control, from behind thick concrete shielding walls, with the operator standing a full quarter-mile away from the assembly. Those 2 deaths reshaped how every nation handles the most dangerous materials on Earth. The screwdriver and the steady human hand gave way to machines, interlocks, and hard physical limits, so that no slip of the wrist could ever cause that blue flash again. Criticality accidents would still happen elsewhere, but never again would American scientists lean over a bare plutonium core with only a screwdriver and their own nerves. So let's bring the whole story back together. A plutonium core, forged as the heart of a third atomic bomb, outlived the war it was built for and became a research tool. And in just 9 months, it caused 2 separate accidents that reached out and touched the lives of 10 different people standing in those rooms. 2 of them, Daghlian and Slotin, died within weeks beyond any shadow of a doubt. The other 8 scattered into wildly different lives. One of them, C. Slicky, died of leukemia in a death tied firmly to that day. Several more, like Hemmerly, Graves, and Young, carried lifelong suspicions that simply could never be proven one way or the other. That is the quiet, unsettling lesson of the Demon Core. Radiation rarely keeps a clean ledger. Some of these men it killed within days, with absolute certainty. Others it may have killed slowly, decades later, in ways that could never truly be proven. And a few it seems to have spared completely. 1 small sphere, 2 bright flashes, and 10 very different fates. If this story was worth your time tonight, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten history just like it. Thank you so much for watching Errata, and we will see you in the next one.